The narrative of David and Goliath, when viewed through the lens of the Nile Valley's most ancient foundations, reveals a cryptic record of the shift from the matriarchal sovereignty of Tesseti to the rising tide of patriarchal governance. In this context, the giant is not a monster, but the vast, established and ancient matrilineal system of the Kushite and Kemetic civilizations. Goliath represents the immense, immovable tradition of the mothers, while David symbolizes the agile, emerging patriarchal order seeking to claim the throne through a new form of tactical dominance. The roots of this struggle trace back to Nabta Playa, where the celestial alignments guided the early cattle-herding matriarchs. Here, the movement of the stars was not a theory, but a lived map of existence. The stone circles served as a biological and spiritual clock, anchoring the people to the rhythm of the mother. When we look at the David and Goliath account, we see the shepherd boy, a figure of nomadic, patriarchal lifestyle, entering the valley to challenge the established sedentary power of the great Philistine, or in our context, the established Kushite lineage. In the Naqada periods, the female form was the primary icon of power. These figurines, with arms raised like the horns of a cow, represented the all-encompassing sky. The giant Goliath is a literary mask for this massive, all-encompassing feminine authority that once governed the Nile. The armor Goliath wears mirrors the ritual regalia of the Kandakis of Meroe, a protective layer of ancestral law that the new patriarchal David finds impossible to penetrate with traditional weapons, necessitating a strike at the very forehead, or the third eye of the matriarchal vision. The Meroitic script, still partially undeciphered, holds the silent voices of the queens who ruled from Napata and Meroe. This script is the hidden code that David's story tries to overwrite. While the biblical text focuses on the triumph of the small over the large, the Meroitic records remind us that the giant was a period of unparalleled stability and female-led prosperity. The war was not fought with swords alone, but through the rewriting of the lineage itself, turning the mother's house into the father's kingdom. Tesseti, the land of the bow, was the first organized state, and its power was rooted in the matriarchal line. The bow, a weapon of precision, relates to the 5 smooth stones David plucked from the brook. These stones are the 5 elements of the Nile Valley: earth, air, fire, water, and spirit, originally managed by the priestesses. David's act of taking these stones represents the patriarchal appropriation of the elemental forces that were once the sole domain of the mothers. In the Kerma culture, the massive defufa structures served as the centers of communal life. These were not tombs, but vibrant hubs of spiritual and political activity. The giant of the parable inhabits such a space of monumental permanence. David, representing the shift toward a more mobile, militarized patriarchy, views the permanence of the matriarchy as an obstacle. The conflict in the Valley of Elah is a reflection of the clash between the permanent mud brick strongholds of the mothers and the nomadic tents of the rising kings. The transition from Napata to Meroe marked a period where the Kandakis, or queen mothers, exerted total control over the coronation of the king. A king could not rule without the mother's sanction. The David and Goliath narrative coyly crypts this by making David the chosen one without a mother's presence in the battlefield. It erases the Kandak's role, presenting a world where male favor is the only currency of power, effectively silencing the matriarchal voice that once determined who was fit to lead. When David strikes Goliath in the forehead, it symbolizes the fracturing of the ancestral memory. In Kemetic and Kushite spirituality, the brow or the uraeus represented the awakening of the inner light. By striking this point, the narrative suggests the blinding of the matriarchal vision, making way for a new, linear, patriarchal way of perceiving the world. It is the moment the spiral of the mother was replaced by the straight line of the father. The sword of Goliath, which David eventually takes for himself, represents the technological transition of the Bronze and Iron Ages. In the matriarchal era, metal was a sacred substance of the earth, used for ritual and adornment. In the hands of the new Davidic order, it became a tool of conquest. By claiming Goliath's sword, David is claiming the right to use the earth's resources for military dominance, a departure from the ecological balance maintained by the Nile mothers. In the ancient Nile, the waters were the source of all potential. The biblical story places the battle in a dry valley, stripping away the fluid, life-giving context of the river. This shift from the wet, fertile matriarchal landscape to the dry, dusty battlefield of the patriarchy is a deliberate literary choice. It removes the mother's influence, which is always strongest where the water flows, and places the conflict in a domain where the shepherd warrior has the advantage. The 5 smooth stones also represent the 5 primary senses that were once attuned to the vibrations of the Nile. The matriarchy governed through intuition and harmony with the environment. David's use of the stone as a projectile turns a piece of the mother's body, the earth, into a weapon against her own system. It is a poignant metaphor for how the patriarchal systems of the later dynasties used the very foundations of matriarchal culture to dismantle its influence. Napata 1, 2, and 3 represent stages of increasing patriarchal encroachment. In the earliest stages, the queen's role was paramount. By the third stage, we see the king's name becoming more prominent in the inscriptions. David's victory is the Napata 3 inches of the biblical world, the final stage where the male figure stands over the fallen giant of the matrilineal past, claiming a victory that is actually the beginning of a long period of spiritual and social imbalance. The Philistines in the story are often described as uncircumcised, a term used to denote the other. In the Nile Valley, the ritual of circumcision was a matriarchal rite of passage into the community of the mothers. By framing the conflict as David versus the uncircumcised giant, the text flips the script. It makes the patriarchal David the insider and the ancient matriarchal system the outsider, or the alien force that must be defeated for the ordered world. Though we avoid that phrase, we see its intent, of the father to begin. The giant Goliath is described as having a height of 6 cubits and a span. In Kemetic mathematics, these numbers correlate to the proportions of the perfect human, often modeled after the female form's reproductive geometry. Goliath is the perfect body of the matriarchal age. David's refusal to wear the traditional armor of King Saul is a rejection of the old ways of the fathers, opting instead for a new, deceptive form of warfare that the matriarchal giant, bound by codes of honor and ritual, cannot anticipate. The Meroitic script's use of 23 signs, including a specific marker for the beginning of words, mirrors the 20 intrinsic paragraphs of this breakdown. Each sign is a gateway back to a time when the word was feminine. David's shout on the battlefield is the replacement of the Meroitic word with a war cry. The ancient gender war was not just physical. It was a war of phonetics and linguistics, where the soft vowels of the mother were hardened into the consonants of the conqueror. In the Kemet of the early dynasties, the king was merely the son of the sun, a title that acknowledged his birth from the feminine celestial source. The David and Goliath account severs this link. David is not a son in the service of the mother. He is a man seeking to be a father unto himself. The fall of the giant is the fall of the requirement that a ruler must be born of a specific matrilineal bloodline to hold the scepter of power. The valley of the battle is a liminal space. In the Nile Valley, these spaces were where the unseen realm met the physical. The matriarchy thrived in this balance. The patriarchal narrative, however, turns this space into a site of conquest. The hidden and forgotten gender wars are buried in the soil of these valleys, where the blood of the matriarchy was shed to fertilize the rise of the patriarchal ego, a process the biblical text celebrates as a miracle. The head of Goliath, which David carries to Jerusalem, is the ultimate trophy of the gender war. It represents the capture of the seat of wisdom. In Cushite tradition, the head was where the Ka and the Ba resided. By taking the head, David is symbolically capturing the soul of the matriarchy and relocating it to a new, patriarchal capital. This is the transfer of authority from the temples of the mothers to the palaces of the kings. We must look at the literary symbolism as a map of what was lost. The giant was the communal, the vast, and the nurturing. David is the individual, the small, and the aggressive. The victory of David is the victory of the part over the whole. In the Nile Valley, the whole was the matriarchy. When Goliath falls, the unity of the Nile tribes begins to fragment into the competing kingdoms and warring factions that define the later patriarchal eras. Ultimately, David and Goliath is a parable of the big silence. The giant does not speak, he only looms and reacts. This is how the patriarchy treats the matriarchal past, as a silent, massive relic that must be overcome. But the Meroitic script, the stones of Nabta-Playa, and the carvings of Taseti tell a different story. They tell of a giant that was full of voice, song, and law. A system that didn't transition, but was systematically overwritten by the sling in the stone of a new, aggressive gender order.